Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Wofford. I'm the confidential advocate with Rbsp. And today it is now the second week of April. So we're getting to be almost halfway through Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is kind of wild to think about. I feel like this year is just flying by already. So today we are going to be talking about sexual assault on college campuses and why freshmen are more vulnerable. And when I was thinking about this topic today, I did start to think about just freshmen and how COVID-19 has really impacted everything. So what we talk about today, I'm also thinking it's not only freshmen that are more vulnerable at this point in time, thinking that with COVID-19, people are starting to get vaccinated, things are starting to get to like a different norm, but college campuses are discussing being back on campus and having more students back on campus. And so I think we see that people are really excited about getting back on campus, about more social events being able to happen in person, programming being able to happen in person. And with that, when I think about risk factors for sexual violence, I'm thinking that they are not going to be more just for the freshman population. I think in general, we'll see a spike due to COVID-19 when more in-person events start to happen. And when we dive into this presentation, you'll be able to understand more why I think that. And I usually like to start my presentations with this quote from Audre Lorde: "To end sexual violence, we have to end all forms of violence." That's not the quote, sorry. The quote is this: "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." But with that being said, to end sexual violence, we have to end all forms of violence. So today, and during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I'm really going to be highlighting and focusing on specifically sexual violence in that spectrum versus other months and different presentations. You might see me speak more to the intersectionality piece of violence. So just for reference, today we're really going to be talking about specifically just sexual assault, and not only sexual assault, but on college campuses, which applies to all of our students. And just a little bit about me. Again, I'm the confidential advocate with Rbsp, so if you ever need to talk or seek support, I am here for you. I am available through Teams, I'm available in person, over the phone, whatever way you feel the most comfortable talking to somebody. I have she, her pronouns. I am a white cisgender heterosexual woman. I like to disclose that just to say what lens I'm speaking from, and understanding that with that, I'm speaking from my own life experiences and can't speak to identities that I don't know as much, but I'm always going to be trying to be inclusive. And I have provided a lot of accompaniment to forensic exams. I've worked on the hotline. I started at a rape crisis center, started help training new advocates. So if you ever have any questions about that, please let me know. And one of my top values in general is humility. And so I always identify myself as a bad advocate, not saying I'm bad at my job, saying that I am constantly in the process of unlearning and learning and working to create the culture that I would want everyone to live in, which is a nonviolent culture. So I know that I'm still a part of the culture that perpetuates rape culture, that our culture is rape culture. I know I'm a part of that. I know I still take part in, listening to songs that just embrace the ideas of sexism. I know that I do that, but that is something that's important to acknowledge, be aware of, and just own. So I just want to say that. So today's objectives, I'm going to briefly talk about Rbsp services. We're going to define sexual violence, talk about the scope of the problem of sexual violence on college campuses, discuss what the red zone is, and risk factors that leave freshmen, and again, with COVID-19, people coming back to campus more vulnerable. We're going to discuss bystander intervention, and finally end with community resources and how you can help create that nonviolent culture I spoke to earlier. So with Rbsp, we provide education, support, and advocacy. Education, like I'm doing right now, we've been doing presentations pretty frequently. We also have Teal Talk Tuesdays during this month. So please check that out. We post them on our Instagram every Tuesday. You can also join us through Zoom with that. We also will give presentations to different classes once requested. We have a Survivor Ally training coming up next Thursday, so please join us for that if you're interested in knowing how to better support survivors. And then support. So what support looks like, again, I'm a confidential advocate, so I am going to support someone if they have directly experienced sexual or relationship violence, or indirectly if they have a friend or a family member, someone that's going through something and they need someplace to talk about that and receive support, that's okay too. So I'm really here for all of our students. All of us in some way are impacted by sexual and relational violence. And so it's important to realize that, and please know that there is never anything that is too big or too small for you to come into our office or reach out in any kind of way. I'm here for you, and if you seek out support services, you will be in control in my office just when we're speaking one-on-one. I'm going to make sure that someone understands what all of their options and their rights are, and I'm going to make sure that they are the ones that can determine their best path towards healing, because it's not my job to give advice. It's not what I'm here for. I'm here to make sure that someone can make an informed decision of how they want to move forward. And with advocacy, I said earlier, to end sexual violence, we have to end all forms of violence. So for advocacy, what that looks like is support is when I'm working like one-on-one with someone. Even if a couple comes into my office, I'm talking to them about their relationship and how to have a more nonviolent relationship. That's direct support. But advocacy is really saying, okay, when you're not in front of me, when I'm talking to leadership about different policies, when I'm talking to Jessica, who's my amazing supervisor, about different things going on with survivors on our campus, like we're doing everything that we can to advocate for them and work on systemic change that is going to create that nonviolent culture and make sure that we are trying to reduce the rates of sexual and relational violence that happen not only on our campus, but in our culture as a whole. Because while today we're focused on sexual assault on college campuses, we know that sexual assault is an epidemic everywhere. It is not siloed to college campuses. So what is sexual violence? I know we talk about this, and if you've seen any of my other presentations, you've probably seen me ask this question. But I think it's always important to start out getting on the same page, setting that foundation of, well, what is this? When we say this, what comes up for us? And a lot of times when speaking to different classes, different students, what I hear people come up with, it's unwanted touch, it is unwanted attention, it is rape, it is sexual assault. So you'll hear a wide variety of answers. And really all of those answers are completely true. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when we talk about sexual violence, I mentioned it's an epidemic, right? It is not siloed to college campuses. So it's not that if someone goes to college that they are at, that now it's way more risky than just living your life. That's not true. But it is important to realize college campuses and being college age, like 18 to 24, and I'm thinking of what we think of with like a traditional college age, like from high school to college quickly, which we know that that's not all the college age population, of course. But it's important to realize that outside of college, just in general in America, every 73 seconds an American is sexually assaulted. So that is just a little over a minute. So in the course of the time that I give this presentation, that is a lot of people. And that number is people, right? I think sometimes when we see numbers, we start to just get in our thinking mind. But if you really take time to hear that, feel that, and think about, check in emotionally with yourself, like, how do you feel about knowing that sexual violence is that frequent, that common? It's really deeply disturbing. It causes a lot of despair, a lot of grief when I'm just thinking about how I feel. And almost, I know for me, it causes like a lot of shame. Like, I don't want America to be known for having sexual violence occur that frequently. Like, that is not okay. I expect more from our culture. I don't want people to have to think it's not a matter of if I experience sexual violence, it's when and how bad is it going to be. I want people to be able to live their lives not impacted. And that's not the reality that we live in right now. So the question becomes, how can we be a part of a change for a better culture? And so I mentioned, how frequent sexual violence is, how frequent sexual assault is. And really, when we're speaking about sexual violence, we're talking about a continuum that consists of sexual assault. It can be as terrible as these heinous crimes such as rape, murder, marital rape, date rape, child rape. And then it can also be the little things like very rigid gender norms, misogynistic practices, just gender violence in general being normalized the way that it's shown in our media, and people don't blink an eye at it. So it can be a lot of different things. But what's important to recognize is that sexual violence is a spectrum. It's not one thing or the other. It's all the things that are rooted in sexism, and sexism is rooted in oppression. And so when we really think about wanting to end sexual violence, the reason why we say we have to end all forms of violence is because we cannot end sexual violence without also talking about racism, ableism, heterosexism, any other form of oppression. So when I talked about advocacy earlier, ending sexual violence really comes down to being willing to stand up against all of these things, which can seem super overwhelming, but that's why today we are really going to hone in on, again, sexual assault on college campuses and how you can make a difference in that way and not think about all of it in general. But definitely keep following us if you're interested in really speaking to more of that intersectional piece, or go back and watch some of our other presentations that we have about addressing more of these problems at once. So for college campuses, focusing on our population, it's important to realize that about 1 in 5 college-age female survivors received assistance from a victim services agency. I think that's really great to think that people are reaching out. When we do think about the rate of sexual violence on college campuses, you often hear people say 1 in 5. I have heard up to 2 in 5. It depends on what research that you look at. This is from RAIN, and I have the resource at the end. But again, it's just really important when we think about 1 in 5 people are reaching out. That's a lot of people when you think about your college campus population. That's 20% of the college campus population. So if those are the people that are reaching out, think of how many people are not reporting and just dealing with it on their own, or the only person that they're talking to is a friend. And it's important to realize that among undergraduate students, 26.4% of females and 6.8% of males, very much speaking in the binary, experience rape or sexual assault through physical force, violence, or incapacitation. And incapacitation can look like through they're incapacitated, and that means that they're not able to consent. So substance could have been used, whether that's drinking, drugs, medication, that they just got their wisdom teeth out. I mean, you can be incapacitated in a lot of different ways. But again, these are very high numbers, very staggering numbers. And that's a very high rate for males. And when you think again about, when we think about women, when we think about gender-based violence, often we talk about women as being victims. So in order to just even think about men coming forward, there's more barriers to overcome to reporting. So when 6.8% of males experience rape or sexual assault, I assume that's a lot more than that. It's just a matter of what we're able to capture and what people are willing to disclose. And something that I think is really interesting, so I know that UTA doesn't have a football team necessarily, but I do find it very interesting that college athletes make up 3.3% of male students, but 19% of those accused of sexual assault typically. And a lot of that is usually around football. And so I don't assume that those statistics align necessarily with UTA by any means, but I just found it a very interesting statistic. And when we look at risk factors later of what can contribute to a culture that's going to produce perpetrators, when we think about football, we think about people who play football as being very hyper-masculine, aggressive, just going to do anything that it takes to win, just very strong, dominant, high profile. Even recruitment practices for football players can sometimes be like, hey, come to this college party, see all the girls that we have here. If you're a football player, you're able to get with girls easier, and that creates a sense of entitlement. And when you think about those dynamics, you can begin to understand why sexual violence would be more prevalent within the college athlete community. And then I think it's very important to recognize that 23.1% of transgender, genderqueer, nonconforming college students have been sexually assaulted. Again, that is from RAINN. And when we think about earlier when I showed that sexual violence continuum, when people have multiple different identities that are going to be targeted, so for gender-based violence, men have historically had power, women have not, so women. And then when we think of that, we're just even speaking in the binary there. And when we think that rigid gender roles are a reason that contributes to sexual violence, this idea of what it means to be a man or a woman, if someone doesn't fall into those boxes, then often the result is they experience violence, whether that is through language or physical acts. So someone who is a woman who presents, whose gender expression is more masculine, can then be called butch or a dyke. And I hate these words, but again, that's showing that people experience violent language when they fall outside of boxes. For men, if someone is not presenting like hyper masculine, or they present more feminine, but they are like a cis man, then they will experience violent language as well. They might be called a pussy, they might be called, I'm trying to think of other words that are coming to my mind right now. They're just, it's like I try to get these words out of my vocabulary because they're just so horrendous and I hate them so much, but it's the reality. So when we think about this rate, it's extremely high, 23.1%. And it's crazy when we think about the anti-trans bills that are trying to be passed through legislation in different places, because transgender and gender nonconforming people are way more likely to be victims of violence than ever perpetuate it. And I think it's so important to realize that when we have conversations around sexual violence, that we acknowledge that our trans community is experiencing sexual violence at alarmingly high rates. And the only way that we can change that is by acknowledging it. And I just wanted to share this quote from Jessica Luther, who wrote this book, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Campuses and the Politics of Sexual Assault, College Football and the Politics of Rape. Sorry, I said that wrong. I have the book at the end as well. But when we get into college, we have idolized dreams about what college is supposed to represent in the lives of young adults. It's a time of exploration, surrounded by peers and learning, all in preparation for going out into the world and becoming somebody. There's no space in these wishful aspirations for the realities of sexual violence that we find everywhere else. And that's why today, when we're going through this presentation, I want you to remind yourself, when we're talking about college campus statistics, when someone doesn't go to college or they decide a different path in their life, that doesn't mean that they're immune to sexual violence. Sexual violence has no boundaries. So while today we are talking about sexual violence on college campuses, it's everywhere. And that's just so important to be aware of. And so there's no reason why, if it exists everywhere else, we shouldn't expect it to be a part of colleges as well. Because a college is just another culture, it's another population that's a part of a bigger culture. And our bigger culture in America that contributes to every 73 seconds in America, someone's being sexually assaulted, that doesn't go away just because someone goes to a college campus. It's under the umbrella. So speaking to that, Rain has these great infographics, and when we talk about college campuses, college women specifically are 3 times as likely than women at different ages to be victims of sexual assault. And then what's interesting to me here is that women who are not in college are 4 times as likely. So, and we're talking about between the ages of 18 and 24. And so we will move on to speaking more to why that could be. And then college age victims of sexual violence often do not report to law enforcement. Very, very common. And this is a list of some reasons as to why. First, for some people, they reported but not to the police. They reported but the police couldn't do anything or just really weren't able to help. These are their reasons. They didn't want to get the perpetrator in trouble. If you think about the perpetrators, 80% of the time the perpetrator is someone that somebody knows. So for college students in particular, especially if someone's just entering college, they may not want to report because they're like just finally getting accepted into a new social group, developing a sense of community. And then if they report somebody within that, there's a fear to be ostracized from that group. So definitely makes sense why someone wouldn't want to report then. Some people don't think it's important enough to report. Again, we live in a rape culture where we are not saying whether we're going to be sexually violated. We are just saying how bad is it going to be. So for some people, they come to college with a childhood of experiencing maybe even childhood sexual abuse or acts of family violence, or they've experienced dating violence before. So for some people, it just doesn't seem as important to report, or because they don't think it's going to go anywhere, it doesn't seem worth their time to go through the process, which again, completely valid, completely makes sense. For other college students, they have a fear of reprisal or fear of retaliation. So especially like there are definitely times where, because sexual violence is all about power and control, there are definitely times where the perpetrator will say, if you report this, I'm gonna leak these photos. If you report this, I'm gonna tell everyone that you are a slut, that you wanted it, that you did this at a different time. Like, people definitely engage in trying to blackmail in a lot of different ways. Or they'll say, if you do this, thinking about sexual violence, you could have a person in a fraternity, a sorority, and one person's in one position, like a pledge, the other is an active member. And so someone just has a higher position of power, and they can say, if you do this, I'm going to make sure that no one in the sorority or fraternity talks to you. And I'm just giving hypothetical examples, but they're very realistic. And so, of course, in those situations, that person is going to really consider, there's going to be so much fear there of, if I do report, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to not have a social life. My parents are going to find out. My friends are going to find out. There's all these realistic fears. And And so that can also be a barrier. And then, of course, there's a lot of other reasons why people don't report to law enforcement. It's really hard when you think of trying to, like if someone comes into my office, if they're considering reporting to law enforcement, always going to be realistic with them about these cases are extremely hard to move forward and prosecute if it comes down to a she said, he said, they said, he said, he said. It comes down to the word of one person against another. Because for the criminal court, it's just a very high standard of evidence that needs to happen for someone to ever spend time in jail. And I do want to give a shout out. I just want to acknowledge that we have an awesome crime victim services department under the UCA Police Department. So crime victim services, we have our crime victim services coordinator, Jennifer Sterling, who if ever anyone is considering if they want to move forward with a criminal report, she is amazing and can be an advocate with you throughout that process and really help you with knowing what every step of the criminal process looks like and be there with you as support. So I just want to say we have that as an amazing resource. If you are ever considering reporting to law enforcement, you can talk to her, find out more, but you don't have to move forward with a report. So now moving forward, I want to get more into the red zone. And the red zone is essentially the first fall semester. It's like pretty much between when fall semester starts and Thanksgiving break, but people have gone as far as to say it's really like the first couple of semesters, because first year students, especially fall semester, are at a higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. And we see this in more than 50% of college sexual assaults occur in either August, September, October, or November. And that was from a survey done in 2017. So we hear about the red zone. That's really scary to think about. Like, people are so excited about going to college. They finally get to go as freshmen. They're getting their first taste of freedom. Just like so excited. College is often something that people look forward to for a while. Because it's a big decision. It's a big commitment when you're talking about going to college. And so to hear this, it's like, well, nobody goes to college to experience sexual assault or sexual violence. Of course not. Like, that's horrible. So why does the red zone exist? And we will be diving more into that. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has what we call identified individual risk factors for sexual violence. And when we think about college campuses, and freshmen in particular, they are definitely at higher risk to be experiencing more of these individual risk factors just by going to college. So thinking about someone leaving their home, living on campus for the first time, they now have no parental supervision. Therefore, they're able to do more things. They don't have to follow rules, like they can set their own rules, their own boundaries, which during this time, it's so exciting because there's so much of a sense of autonomy. During this time, it's also a higher risk time because there is this new freedom and this new excitement around exploring more of who you are, more of your identity. And what we know is alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. And when we think about the college experience, a lot of times people think about college parties. Not the same for everybody. I'm not saying that every person who goes to college wants to go out and party. But for a lot of people, you say, hey, college, they will think of parties. They will think about social events. And at social events, especially if there's alcohol, there's just a higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. So naturally, if someone goes to college, if they're exploring, if they're using alcohol, then they're just going to be at a higher risk. That does not mean that if someone is drinking, it's their fault. Absolutely not. Someone should be able to drink and be blackout drunk and be in the middle of the street naked and nobody will violate their body. But that's not the reality that we live in. So I really want to make that clear. When we're talking about risk factors, we are not saying that if someone is experiencing any of these, that's their fault. It is never the victim's fault or survivor's fault if they've been sexually violated. Another risk factor that really stood out to me is preference for impersonal sex or sexual risk-taking. Again, when people go to college, there's a lot of apps now. There's very much more of a hookup culture now. And I say that I am not a college student, so people can totally correct me if I'm wrong. But a lot of people have a fear of being rejected. And so even with that, people have a fear of being rejected. So one person might have a couple of drinks to feel braver about trying to make a move on someone else. And the reason that they feel that, and they want the other person to have a couple of drinks so that they can both say, hey, that was a mistake. Or one person can say like, oh yeah, this did happen, but it only happened because I was drinking. I'm not actually into that person. Or I'm trying to think, it's like if they both are genuinely interested in each other, or one person's more interested in the other but doesn't hear back from the person, they'll be like, oh, well, they were drinking, so it wasn't. So like drinking just adds in a whole lot of other factors and dynamics. And often people use drinking as a social lubricant, but drinking does not go well with consent, which we will talk about. And again, is the #1 date rape drug. And so when we think about sexual risk taking, when we think about people feeling more comfortable of just and wanting to explore their sexuality, that is very, very normal. But if one person is wanting to explore their sexuality and the other person is not, or they're just not on the same page, then it just doesn't work. Or if one person just wants to engage in sex but is seeing the other person as an object and not as a human, that is a huge problem. And we live in a culture that has really objectified women to the extent that women are seen as people to be conquested. I don't know if I used that right. But there's that sexual entitlement piece that goes there as well. So all of those things fall into risk factors. And then exposure to sexually explicit media stood out to me. What we know, especially about porn, is that most people watch porn, have seen porn at some point in time. And that can start from a much younger age. And there's not a problem with porn inherently, but there's a problem with sexism within porn, or the fact that violence against women is normalized in porn, or it's seen as something that women want in porn, but that doesn't translate to real life. and when someone watches porn, they're more likely to think afterwards, oh, that person wanted it, when that's just not realistic. I saw a research study, and I wish I had it on here, that talked about how after somebody watches porn, like right after, people are more likely to believe rape myths, like victim blaming, the person wanted it. And so that just really was so interesting to me. And when we think about, again, going to college, maybe at home you have parental controls, you have your phone gets checked, and still people can access porn, don't get me wrong, but if someone has more freedom, they might be able to do that a lot more often. And just by doing that, that increases that risk factor. And then these other things that I have listed here are also different risk factors. But really the biggest one that stands out to me on an individual level is the alcohol and drug use. And it is just this new sense of freedom. And when someone has a new sense of freedom, they are trying to establish a sense of community. And when you're doing that, you might want to go to a party. You might want to have alcohol as a social lubricant. You might want to be a little bit more sexually risk-taking because you think that seems like the norm, or hookup culture is the norm and you just want to explore. So really just wanting to explore your identity, being excited about your freedom, and just that autonomy can all be like those things in general are so great. And that is why college can be such an amazing time. But those things also put you at a riskier level for experiencing sexual violence, which is by no means okay. But when people get accepted into college, they're not thinking, oh, well, if I go to this party, I'm going to experience sexual violence. They're thinking like, oh, like one of my first college parties. Like they're so excited. And so thinking of that excitement, kind of the blinders come on and it's like the risk factors aren't in our mind. So we just want to keep them within our mind. And a lot of people in college, and I say in college, but a lot of people in life just don't have an understanding of consent. And that is not often their fault. I'm by no means saying that, but they don't have an understanding of consent because no one has ever talked to them about it, or because there's not comprehensive sex positive education, or there's no sex education in general. So people, when they don't have an understanding of consent, are likely to sexually violate someone else. And so that in our culture produces perpetrators. And I think it's important to acknowledge, like, even when someone gets into a relationship, your partner never belongs to you. At best, they are on loan with an option to renew. I love this quote from Esther Perel. She's an amazing couples therapist. The consent is always in that moment, and it can change, it can be withdrawn. Someone can consent to kissing, but not consent to oral, not consent to penetration. Consent is on a spectrum. And if someone consents to having sex one time, it doesn't mean that they ever have to again, ever in the future. Or a location doesn't mean consent. Going to someone's dorm room doesn't mean that they want to have sex with you, which unfortunately people think all the time. And I love these images, and I pulled them from Instagram, and I actually need to go back and put in all the handles that I pulled these from, just because that's the right thing to do. And I feel so bad that I didn't do that. But I love this one. No doesn't mean convince me. When we think about romantic comedies that people see where someone turns someone else down and then they like relentlessly pursue them until they say yes, like that is not okay. In so many romantic comedies, we see different stalking behaviors. If someone says no at a party prior to drinking, then you want to be cautious. Like if they start drinking and get to a point that they're incapacitated, that's not your yes. Absolutely not. So no does not mean convince me. If someone says no, which people do in many different ways, then that should just be accepted gracefully. So I'm thinking what comes up for me if someone says no to wanting to go on a date, don't continue to ask them. If they decide later that they want to revisit that with you, they can tell you and take the lead on that. But no does not mean convince me. If alcohol is involved, just like be aware that even if both people are drinking, both people the next day can be thought of as perpetrators, right? Both people are incapacitated. They can't both remember what's going on. You both are in the position that you could have sexually violated the other one and not been aware of it. And that is absolutely not okay. So if you're drinking, it's just best to wait till you're sober to make your moves. And reminder, people might not actually feel how you think they feel. So people say no in a lot of ways. Some people say no through body language. Some people say no directly. Some people say no by trying to distract from the situation. Like if you ask them a question, they might just be like, oh, what do you think about the weather? Like just completely change topics. So if you want to engage in something with someone, like if you want to make that first move, if you want to kiss somebody, it is okay and it is great to ask somebody, because you might be assuming that they want the same thing, but you can't know. Even when we think about how we all express our emotions, I express anger different than somebody else does. So someone could look at my face and think I'm in a good mood or I'm bored, but really I'm furious because when I'm angry, I just kind of shut down. And people aren't going to know unless they ask me. I'm not going to tell them, like I'm not going to go on an angry outrage because that's just not who I am. I'm shut down. And it takes me a while to process things. So like everybody expresses their emotions differently. Everyone expresses their comfort with intimacy differently. And so it's always important to check in with somebody and ask. And you can change your mind. So again, just because someone is thinking at one point that they want to engage in sex and then they realize, oh no, I actually just want to make out tonight. I just want to kiss. I'm not ready to go that far. That is also completely okay. And again, there should never be pressure. All of these situations come up not only on college campuses, but just in life. And it's really important that we start to have conversations with people about consent early when we think about even children as they're growing up. When a child is told, like, go give mom and dad a hug, go give grandpa a hug before you leave, otherwise you're rude. We need to be thinking about what message that sends to somebody about their bodily autonomy. And we just need to be doing that in general. If you're in a public situation and someone comes up to you with like the hugging hands and you're not interested in hugging at all, it's considered disrespectful as a social norm. If you're like, no, I don't want to hug. That is really not okay. So we need to work on, again, just shifting those norms. We need to work on incorporating consent in many different aspects of our lives. Is it okay if I give you a hug? Is it okay if I hold your hand? And yes, once you start to have a relationship with someone, you start to become more comfortable with like hand holding or hugging, like you both pick up on each other's cues. But again, it's still really important to check in, especially when engaging in more intimate acts of, is this next step okay? And then moving back to the Center for Disease Control's risk factors, poverty is one, lack of employment, lack of institutional support from police and judicial system. When I think about universities, I think about, it is hard to, again, still go through the Title IX or the conduct process. And when it, again, comes down to a she said, he said, they said case, it's still hard to feel supported or believe that doesn't go through. And that's just the reality. Like, it's really difficult to feel support if you feel like you're reporting something, and whether it's to the police, to Title IX, and the person doesn't get any sense of found responsible or charged or arrested. That can be really, really difficult. And when other survivors see that happen to another one, it's like, why would I want to go through that process? So people stop reporting. And it's everyone's choice again. And then if there's a general tolerance of sexual violence within the community. So again, if we see that people aren't held accountable, or that it is a norm within a fraternity to have a room designated for people to go to after a party for people to have sex. Well, again, if they're both drinking, that's completely inappropriate. I know that I say that because I'm aware that that's happened on college campuses that I've been on. It's like, whoa, that is not okay. And it's not like the women that were going to those parties were aware of it. They found out after being sexually assaulted. And that's, again, 100% not okay. But that's like a very much an example of a tolerance of sexual violence within the community. And I want to be very clear, I'm not speaking to that happens on our campus. I'm just saying that I know examples from other campuses. If there's weak community sanctions against sexual violence perpetrators. So let's say that someone's in a fraternity sorority, finds out that there was someone who was a perpetrator or accused of perpetrating violence towards someone else, if they're not held accountable by the other people within their community, sexual violence is just going to continue to happen and be considered the norm or okay. And so people have to address it head on and give people harsher consequences like suspension, like probation, like expulsion from like a social group, really. And I wanted to highlight, like, when I think about poverty, a lot of students get on, financial aid, scholarships, college is expensive. People are trying to meet their basic needs. And when that happens, when someone has to really be focused on that, that can become a risk factor. So I just wanted to point that out. And when I saw lack of employment opportunities, that came up for me with COVID-19 as well. I know a lot of different college students were laid off from their part-time jobs, full-time jobs because of XYZ reason. There's just no funding anymore. There's not a need anymore, and because the business can't continue to operate. So we've seen a lot of students come at higher risk for sexual violence, just even with COVID-19. And then societal factors. So the CDC talks about societal factors. This is like the large scope. So any social norms that support sexual violence, norms that support male superiority and sexual entitlement, and that's where really a lot of athletics and jock culture can come in. Like, there's a lot of overlap between jock culture and rape culture. When you think about locker room talk or boys will be boys, talking about sexual conquest. I read this book called Boys and Sex by Peggy Orenstein that really talked about how even for men, this is harmful for men, because even men were saying, I left sports because of what was going on in the locker room, or because of this hyper masculine culture of you have to be strong, you have to be aggressive. And they didn't want to take part in it, even though they loved the sport. And so when we talk about these risk factors, they're not only harmful towards women, they're harmful towards men, they're harmful towards anyone who's gender nonconforming. So it's just harmful towards society in general. And societal norms that maintain women's inferiority and sexual submissiveness. So any perpetuation of, even when we think about the intersection of rape and of race and gender, which gender is a social construct. But when we think about, okay, so someone's an Asian woman, a lot of times in the media, an Asian woman is represented as like submissive, silent, just like a willing participant, like be told what to do and do it. And like, that's terrible. That is not an okay representation to happen everywhere, because that's essentially, again, sexual entitlement, or a man can just tell her what to do and she will obey. And this idea of seeing any women just obey and not be equals can perpetuate sexual violence. And then finally, weak laws and policies related to sexual violence and gender equity. So even when we saw the last administration under Trump bring on the new Title IX policies, the new Title IX policies essentially said it was unfair to respondents, to people who were accused of the process that they had to go through. And so many survivor support advocacy groups said these new Title IX regulations are harmful towards survivors. And when we have weak laws or policies related to sexual violence, we are going to see more sexual violence occur, because there becomes this idea that no one's going to be held accountable, which is just part of our culture. Which is why I'm really excited, by the way, about seeing that new Title IX regulations are going to be probably implemented, although I know that we're not going to see them anytime soon. So with all this being said, there's tons of different risk factors that someone experiences when they're coming to college campus. And that's not only for freshmen anymore. When I think about freshmen who came to UTA last year, like their freshman experience obviously wasn't normal because of COVID-19. So I think a lot of this is going to come up. And with people coming back to campus, like there's going to be a spike because people are starting to go to social events. There's probably going to be more parties, more alcohol, more exploration. And with that, higher rates of sexual violence. And so with that, the question becomes, how can you help reduce the rates of sexual violence on campus? And you can do this. Our MAV Stand Up program talks about being a bystander. So if you see something, say something, and do something in that moment, you can help someone by preventing sexual violence from ever happening in the first place. So you have to just recognize when a situation is kind of sketchy or wrong, and then choose what you're going to do and act on that. So for recognition, you could be in a situation that you are at a party, you see that someone has had, 8 drinks, and so they're not in any place to consent, and someone trying to walk out with them, maybe you say, hey, actually just come over here. We're going to stay, or I'm going to make sure you get a safe ride home tonight. So intervening in that moment. Recognizing doesn't also have to be seeing such a dramatic act of sexual violence about to occur. It could be recognizing somebody's language is inappropriate or not okay or is sexist. It could be recognizing someone's language trivializes what rape is. I have heard numerous times people make a joke and say, I just raped that exam, and use it as a way of saying I just did really well at that exam. That's terrible. That's absolutely not okay. That is just heinous language to use. And for that person, they're making a joke. And then for someone else, they're bringing up one of their most traumatic moments in their life. And it's horrible. And so in that moment, someone can choose to say, hey, that is not okay to say at all. Like, that's not cool with me. That doesn't fly with me. It doesn't sit well with me. Keep saying things like that and don't really want to be your friend. And saying things like that can, again, help reduce the rates of sexual violence, because by minimizing the sexist comments, we will indirectly minimize and reduce the more heinous acts of sexual violence that occur. So in order to recognize, choose, and act, acting can look like 4 different Ds. It's a good way to remember them, I think. So acting can look like distracting and interrupting the incident or event with something that's unrelated. You can pretend you're friends with the person experiencing the behavior. You can ask for help finding something, like, hey, can you help me find my phone? If you see someone being catcalled on the streets, you can say, hey, could you come over here? I need directions to find Ransom Hall. So really just doing something that interrupts the flow of the potential violence. It's useful when folks aren't sure what to do in a situation, and it can give people a chance just to get out of the situation or give other people a window to enter the situation, which will interrupt it entirely. You can also just be really direct and say, I see what you're doing, stop it. So you just address the behavior in the moment, name it, say why you're not okay with that behavior, and see if the person that's experiencing that behavior needs more help in that situation. Direct intervention involves confronting the person or confronting and talking to the potential target about what you think is happening and seeing if they still want you to intervene. It can be the easiest if you actually know the people involved. So being direct is like, if you have a good rapport with someone, you feel like you're able to hold them accountable and feel safe about that. Or you know the person who you think is being targeted and you feel like they're going to be receptive to hearing you when you say, hey, I think this person is trying to do this. You can also delegate. So if you don't feel comfortable yourself intervening, or especially for people with more intersecting marginalized identities, it's not even safe at times. If it's not safe, then you can delegate someone else to go in. So just bring someone else to help you, maybe someone who's better situated in dealing with those behaviors. That's like for us, you could say, hey, I want to report this to Title IX, or I want to go talk to the confidential advocate, see if they'll reach out to who I thought was the potential target to ask them how they felt about that situation. Alert a supervisor, ask them to intervene, or just someone who has more authority in that situation. So that could be like at a fraternity sorority, like alerting the president, alerting someone else who's around who just you feel like they have more buy-in if they say something. And that can be more helpful if you don't know the person as well. That's potentially thought to be targeted. Or if you just don't feel safe to handle a situation or equipped. And delay is the last one. If you are unable to act in the moment because of safety concerns, location, your proximity to the other person, then you can just check back in later. And after the incident, potentially, you're offering them resources, you're seeing if they need any help, you're seeing if they want to talk, and telling them, hey, I did notice that the other day, or I heard you say this the other day and that wasn't okay. What you experienced is not okay. And so delay could be a matter of supporting a survivor after the incident, or someone who experienced or heard that at that comment that I said earlier, like I just wrote that exam. It could be saying to someone afterwards, I didn't say anything in that moment. I didn't feel safe, but I do want you to know that I was not okay with that. So delay can even just be kind of rebuilding that relationship if you're thinking in the moment, like I wanted to say something in that moment, but I just wasn't ready to, so I'm going to say something now. So those are different ways that you can intervene in the moment or even a little bit after the moment. And those are different ways that you can help support survivors on campus and work towards creating a more nonviolent campus culture. With people starting to come back to in-person events, with people starting to go to more social outings and feeling more comfortable with that. Again, not everybody, which is completely fine and normal, but with that happening, we should expect to see people being at higher risk for experiencing sexual violence, not only on campus like college campuses, but everywhere, realistically. Any communities that are feeling more comfortable going out, especially I'm thinking like the weather's really nice, so people want to be out, like for this whole area, if someone's over the age of 21, like even going out to have a patio drink, and then multiple becomes really normalized. And again, it's just so important to remember alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. If you ever have any questions about anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. And no, again, if someone is drinking or using any substances or exploring anything, their autonomy, their freedom, and excited about that, there is nothing that anyone could ever do that ever says, oh, they did this, so they deserved it. Never, never, never. It is never the victim or survivor's fault, and I cannot explain or highlight that enough. So just know that you should be able to be passed out on the street naked and nobody would ever violate your body. And I just want to make that very clear. If you are ever in need of supportive services or know someone who you think might benefit from our support, then please know that they can reach out to me, whether that's through email, phone, or in person. We also have our survivor support groups, which are in person Monday, Tuesday, Thursdays, and Fridays from 12 to 1, and virtual on Wednesdays at 2. We also have CAPS, which is an amazing resource, the Women's Center, which is an amazing community resource, our UTA Police Department and Crime Victim Services, which I highlighted earlier, Title IX for university reporting, our behavioral intervention team. If you're like, I don't know if this falls under relational or sexual violence, but I know I realized that this person the other day said that they just feel like going to sleep and not waking up. So who do I go to? Then our behavioral intervention team is a really good resource for that. And please just follow us on our Instagram for more information about what our upcoming events are. These are my references. And so this is my contact information and our social media platforms. So please follow us, like us, and if there's ever any presentations that you want to see, let us know. Happy to do that for you. And I really appreciate you joining me today. So have a good one. Bye.